Good evening, viewers. This is Kemet Sane. As I earlier posted today that I will have an exclusive interview with Honourable Halifa Sallah regarding the Covid-19 and issues that are surrounding him and the state of emergency that was declared by the National Assembly and through the executive, and issues that are surrounding the whole issue of Covid-19 in our country and the steps that have been taken so far. So our interview will be centered on these issues. Here I have Honourable Halifa Sallah. First, we will discuss in English for the international audience to understand why we are having this interview. And in our other programs, we will definitely bring you the local language, both Mandinka and the Wolof version. But today we will center on the English version for the vast majority of the Gambian people to understand the context and what we are explaining here. And we have Honourable Halifa Sallah here with you. Honourable Halifa Sallah, the viewers are with you here.
Thank you very much. I hope that we will be able to satisfy their concerns.
Thank you, Honourable Sallah, for having you once again. We will just start directly to the issue of Covid-19, as we know that this has been a pandemic that has emerged in the world. We are faced with this pandemic, and the number has been increased in the Gambia here, and a state of emergency has been declared by both the executive and the National Assembly, since the executive cannot do it alone without the approval of the National Assembly. Can you take us through what is your take on the increased number of Covid-19 and the state of emergency? What are the regulations so far attached to the state of emergency, since there is divergent view of what are the regulations and people don't understand the whole issue of Covid-19 and the state of emergency?
Information is certainly the driving force of development, and that is why the efforts the media fraternity is actually making should be commended. COVID-19 requires information. It requires the change of mindset. It requires the constant transfer of knowledge to those who never knew what medical science is all about. We, as leaders, must become concerned that you can only lead if people are alive. And if any matter arises that is capable of in fact carrying a genocide against the people, we cannot justify any delay in taking extraordinary measures to be able to address the tragedy that we call COVID-19. The nation would recall that the pandemic became a matter of concern at the level of the National Assembly, where a select committee on health had done groundwork to find out the level of preparedness for any eventuality of having the COVID-19 virus invading the Gambia. And in that discussion, the Ministry of Health was invited to give a situational report, an update. At that material time, we were told that the disease had not been discovered in the Gambia. But that same evening, we were told by the minister at a national address that indeed a person has been found to be positive, and therefore the alarm bells were on, and we had to move into action. We were told by the health authority that they would begin by monitoring the the airport, seaport, entry point to the country, because the disease was exogenous, it was from the outside. And if something is from the outside, then how do you address it? It's to prevent it from coming in. So the preventive strategy became the major strategy to be able to deal with COVID-19. Eventually, we were told that 4 people had been found to be positive. 1 had died, and 2 were under a treatment. That is one issue that needs to be clear. What is treatment? We are told that COVID-19 has no cure. So if you come again and say people are under treatment, and ultimately we are told that 2 had successfully gone through treatment, then you have the contradiction. How were they cured? And that is the beginning of my emphasis, that we must learn from the doctors, we must listen to them to know what is happening. We should not be doubting Thomases and continue to express doubt about everything without carrying out proper investigation to know. We should search to know, not simply ask questions. There are answers to the questions we are asking. And each Gambian should be alert in asking the right people the right questions at the right time. Context and content must go together in order for us to be able to fully understand what COVID-19 is all about. And the lessons are clear. What we've learned from the doctors is simply this, that human beings are born with the capacity to fight illness, that their bodies are embodiment of the means to fight illness. And once the fight starts and your body is strong enough, your cells are strong enough to defeat the illness, then you may feel feverish, but ultimately you will discover that you are well. So you'll believe there is a miracle. But the reality is that your body was able to develop enough cells to fight the illness. But if the illness succeeds in defeating your body, the cells of your body, then you will be gripped with visible illness where you would need to go to a doctor for cure. When you get to the doctor, what the doctor does is to diagnose your symptoms and then indicate what is wrong with you, and then prescribe what should facilitate cure. Once a prescription is made, what you are actually taking is going to fight the illness. And by defeating the disease, you become cured. What the doctors are telling us is that with COVID-19, if you fail to see a doctor on time until the virus defeats the cells that are fighting to defeat it, then you must surrender to the virus. And when you go to the doctors for help, they will tell you there is no cure. So the fever, the coughing will move into pneumonia, destruction of your lungs, and other implications which cause death. This is what has happened in China. It is happening in America. It is happening in Europe. It is happening in every part of the world. And that is why the WHO alarms the world that a disease is there that is a killer.
And at the moment, the doctors do not have any cure. If you are found to be positive early, they may be able to fight the symptoms and energize your cells and their capacity to fight back, and you may be successful in defeating the virus. But for them, there is no medicine they can give you that will go and attack the virus and kill it and facilitate your cure. And they are the doctors. This is why when it became discovered that the disease is actually in, of course from the outside, but it is known that it can spread internally. How will it spread? They told us that the disease, once the virus invades your respiratory system through your mouth, through your nose, what it does is to settle, cause cough, fever, and then the other symptoms will emerge. Therefore, there is a preliminary stage of discovering whether the person has it or not. And the preliminary stage is a stage where certain symptoms are identified, the fever and the cough. This is when they said that to help contain the illness, those coming from the outside would have to go through some form of screening. Screening and testing are not the same. Screening means that they will begin to look at some of the symptoms that could ultimately be confirmed to be symptoms of the virus. Therefore, one of the gadgets is the thermometer. That is utilized to screen those who come in. And if their body temperature exceeds what is expected, then those people could be taken aside to be observed. That is really protective observation. Let's abandon the word isolation. They are not being isolated because doctors are going to look after them. Nurses are going to look after them. And those people who are engaged in testing in the laboratories will look after them. So they are not isolated. They are moved for protective observation by those who have the competence to do that. And that's what everybody should know. And that is the starting point, showing you the investment that must be made to be able to address COVID-19. If you remove somebody from his or her home and have to accommodate that person somewhere, it is like you are hospitalizing the person. But this time, it is just meant for screening. But the screening will have to go for 14 days. So you have to feed that person. You must provide that person with an environment that is convenient. In that respect, you must have investment. So there are financial costs. There are costs in human resources because doctors will be there, nurses will be there, laboratory technicians will be there. So we are talking about financial implications of COVID-19. So when you say that a country is prepared, it means that that country must be able to provide the thermometers, must be provide the human resources enough to be able to test or to be able to screen those people and ultimately conduct the test. So it means you must have the laboratories. You must also have the material resources where you're going to keep them. So to us, it was an emergency. That preparedness was not there. So with immediacy, they would have to find where to accommodate people. And they started accommodating people in certain hotels. Information is coming out that they are also accommodated in diverse places. So it is therefore significant to fully understand what is required to be able to address the problem. From that angle, Gambia started the process of screening and then holding people in protective observation. Ultimately, we heard about the 4 cases, and then you move from protective observation to actual treatment. Treatment means those people also will now have to be moved and be hospitalized because they are diagnosed to be positive. And in that regard, you'll have to go through the process of giving them what is needed to be able to help them to restore their health. But we are told by the doctors that the scale of infection and the time would make the illness to signify different symptoms at different times. So apparently, we are not told of those extreme cases where the person will have to need other things that would cost more, like the ventilators. This will cost more. People with extreme illness where they've lost total control of even their minds, that they are no longer conscious of what is happening, and they would have to be given support systems in order to enable them to gain more strength to fight back. Do we have all those things? We must anticipate that it can get to that level. And that is why the doctors told us from the very beginning that we must use preventive measures to deal with a problem which we are yet to have all the material resources necessary and financial resources necessary to be able to address if it develops to a large scale. Now, that is what brought about the government's responsibility. The government is expected to provide all the facilities necessary to be able to screen people, but also to be able to treat them. That will require human resources, that will require material resources. It will require equipment. As the problem increases, and here diagnosis mapped the problem to be in the URR as well as the West Coast health region, because health region is different from our normal regions. They have their own designation of West Coast health region, Western health region, and other regions. It appears that this is where from Bajul all the way to the Combos and then URR. What is very evident now is that while all the previous cases were said to be imported according to their own language, imported, we say from exogenous sources, they have 2 cases now, after the last declaration that 5 other cases have been found, 2 cases which resulted from infection from within, the spreading of the illness. So once you say infection from within, is that the illness is spreading to those people who somehow came into contact with people who came with the illness. That is the headache of the Ministry of Health, guided by Dr. Samate, that they do not know how many people with the illness had actually gone inside and have actually had contact with their family members and may have transferred their illness to them. That is the problem of the Gambia. And that is the focus, that should be the priority. Fundamentally then, since the health system was unprepared, is still not fully prepared, the health system must adjust contextually to the dynamics of the problem. Now we are beginning to understand the dynamics of the problem. We see visible people with the illness from communities. What should be done? It means that those communities immediately should be the centers of concentration. You must be able to shield those communities. You must be able to spray the areas. You must deal with the family. You must deal with the community. So the center of gravity of the problem would shift. And therefore, focus should be placed on that area where the illness is now visible. And that's what personally I would like to see, that wherever somebody has been moved, either for protective screening, observation, or have actually been found, we must accompany the family and the community, psychosocially, and also in preparation of protecting them from the spread of the infection. And that would require strategy. It would require people who will be able to speak to the family, because people don't want stigma. And when illness is stigmatized, then people run away from accepting that they are afflicted with it. So we must help people to understand that illness is an enemy, and the person coming is a friend to help you to defeat the enemy. That person is supporting you. That person must support you physically, medically, psychosocially, even economically. And this is the first concentration. What the government ultimately did was to tell the nation that in order to deal with COVID-19, there was need for a state of emergency. When you talk about a state of emergency, you are talking about law. It was essential, it is still essential, for the rule of law to prevail. And wherever something is seen to be necessary, then we must find out whether it's backed by law, and we must create the law that backs it in order to ensure that actions are based on law. The President addressed the nation, indicating that measures must be taken to contain the illness. And this is where I would want people to focus on measures to contain the illness. If the measures are reasonable, if they are justifiable, then they are the right measures. If they are not reasonable, if they are not justifiable, they are not the right measures. How do we know which measures are reasonable and justifiable? First of all, we must know the context, and the context is a health context. Section 34 of the Constitution envisages a time where there is a national threat that is not ordinary, that leads to a breakdown of order and makes it impossible for normalcy to be maintained. That can come through armed combat, where you have a civil war, and then the usual controls are no longer valid. In that case, then you need governance that is contextual to retaining the power of those who are elected to manage the situation until normalcy is returned. But another situation is that the threat may not only be a threat to public order, it may also be a threat to public safety, it may be a threat to public health, it may be a threat of different kind. But we are not used to threat to public health that simulates as if it could eradicate all of us. That will have a genocidal tendency. And COVID-19 is declared by WHO to be a pandemic of unimaginable proportion. and could lead to total devastation of the life of a country. Not only was it declared so, but it became very clear that the way it spread is so swift because it relies on social relationships. And an illness that relies on social relationships is the greatest threat to our human existence, because husbands and wives must relate. Fathers and mothers, and fathers and children and mothers and children must relate. Neighbors must relate. Friends must relate. Human society is founded on that close affinity between people. So if what is now a virus could spread by coughing, could spread by close contact. If you talk about coughing, just imagine kissing and all those things that people have used to show love and affinity. Then you can imagine what a threat COVID-19 is. And because of that, they discovered that since is a disease, social relationship, to survive and spread, it must be deprived of the capacity to spread by ensuring that we have safe spacing between human beings. Not only safe spacing, but maintaining the type of cleanliness that will deprive it of the opportunity to spread. Not only to spread, but also ensuring that there is early detection to enable the doctors to give the person the support that is necessary to be able to combat the illness and be alive. So it's a combination of early detection, safe spacing, cleanliness, so that we will not be able to spread the disease by ensuring that we reduce the social contact. This is what is found to be the fact. That is the angle of medical science as it dovetails into law, policy, and administration. One can see the concept of a state of emergency where the president declares that this COVID-19 is a threat to our existence, and therefore extraordinary measures are needed. But what the Constitution says under Section 34 is that where such a situation exists that is conceived as a state of public emergency or may exist if certain actions are not taken, then the president can make a proclamation which must be published in the Gazette. But that is where it stops. The president would make a proclamation that is published in the Gazette. But the reason for the proclamation is to be able to take extraordinary measures. But nothing is said about those extraordinary measures under Section 34. That is why, if you look at the proclamation made by the president and adding that, well, this action, these measures are not supposed to be done, even if the intention was good, what was said had no legal base, no legal foundation. And that is what has caused the first confusion that this should not be, must be, different things were said. That is the first dimension. The proclamation is a proclamation of public emergency. But what should follow are measures. But what should justify the measures is what is actually stated under Section 35, not 34, Section 35 of the Constitution, which shows that measures could be taken, and the measures is to have an act. State of Emergency Act. And that act under Section 35 would actually provide the basis for the measures that should be taken to ensure that one deals with what caused the proclamation. And those measures must come in the form of regulations. So the regulations also must be reasonably justifiable in terms of addressing the specific issue that is considered to be the threat. That is the linkage. You have the power to make proclamation, power to make regulation, but the regulations must be fit for purpose. They must be regulation restricted by the need to address the problems you have identified as constituting a state of public emergency. What the law also says, power in the hands of the president is not absolute. It must be checked. And that is why Section 34 limits the time frame of the state of public emergency declared by the president. It states that if the National Assembly is sitting, the state of public emergency declared by the president will last for 7 days. Within those 7 days, if the National Assembly is sitting, the president should bring the proclamation to the National Assembly for an extension, which could go up to 90 days or less if the National Assembly deems it fit. That is the word of the Constitution. So when that happens, the National Assembly will examine the proclamation, but will also examine the regulations taken. And those regulations would have to be scrutinized to see whether they are fit for purpose, they are reasonable and justifiable to be able to address the purpose for declaring the state of public emergency. Those are the powers of the National Assembly, and with 2/3 majority, the declaration, proclamation, and the regulations could be extended for the period that has been accepted by the National Assembly. It is important, therefore, before we look at the regulation, we look at the process at the National Assembly, because the Constitution says if the National Assembly is not sitting, then the proclamation would last for 21 days to give opportunity for the National Assembly to be convened, and there within 21 days could bring the proclamation and the regulation again to the National Assembly for extension. The country would recall that the minister did bring a proclamation dated 26 March, not the one dated 18th March. He brought the one dated 26 March, where the president did make a proclamation, and the proclamation also went with some regulations because it indicated what should or should not be done in the country. And when that was brought, there was a request for the National Assembly to extend the state of public emergency to 90 days, and that was the debate. And people are divided in what happened at the National Assembly. It is important to help the people to understand the context, and then we interrogate whether what happened was right and proper or improper. The context was to bring a proclamation after the first one, declared on the 18th of March, had lasted for more than 7 days and had lapsed. And it was not brought. And a new proclamation was brought. And it was supposed to be supported because it was declared on the 26th. At the level of the National Assembly, I did raise the question that we had two proclamations. And one was supposed to last for 7 days because the National Assembly had indeed been sitting and had not been adjourned sine die. We just suspended the sitting. Therefore, why didn't they bring the 18th March proclamation before the 7 days lapse? That was one fundamental question raised. Number two, if the first proclamation lapsed, then the regulation also lapsed. Were the regulations being implemented after the proclamation lapsed? That was also a key question that was raised. It was indicated that if we allow this to happen, we are creating a precedent where the president can declare proclamation and it lapses, then come and declare proclamation, so you can declare that to eternity. So the provision that said the proclamation could be made is not also intended to give the president the license to continue to rule by state of emergency by proclamation. That would be a misconception of what the Constitution required. The Constitution required checks and balances. So in that sense, it was deemed necessary for what was being demanded to be referred to a committee of the National Assembly to scrutinize the proclamation, the regulation, and come and advise a parliament. Ultimately, the National Assembly members accepted that. And that is what was done. And eventually, the minister did indicate that they were not fully sure. In fact, they didn't know. That is the report of the National Assembly, that the National Assembly was sitting. But if they really knew, they would not have gone to the level of declaring a second one. They would have brought the first one. Fine. So now, history has recorded that whenever we have a state of emergency and the National Assembly is sitting, before the 7 days, they will bring that proclamation to the National Assembly for extension. That is history. And it should be underscored. And the National Assembly should be seen to have done its duty to save this country from abuse of power. But many people are not saying that. When the national proclamation was made, many people started hiding in their homes. Everybody felt that that is it. Freedom will never be exercised by anybody again. Assembly saved the nation, and the nation should recognize that to show that the power of the president is not absolute. And number two, it became very clear in the analysis that even the regulations would require gauging by the National Assembly and endorsement by the National Assembly. So then the battle was, the executive requested 90 days. They were given 45 days. Some wanted 2 weeks, some wanted a month. We are now dealing with the content of the declaration.
Yes, Honourable, before going there, I just want to throw you back because this has been a debate when the National Assembly actually decided, because there are few governments that do look at the Constitution and what they meant to observe during the agreement to declare a state of emergency for 45 days. They meant to understand that the Constitution is 3/3 of the National Assembly members must accept before it becomes a law or before it to be approved by the National Assembly. 3/3 must support.
Two-thirds.
Then 2/3 must support that motion. But during your voting, we could not determine whether we actually have that 3/3. So they want to understand how,
two-thirds, yeah.
how the whole process went and how did we lead to, because it's a constitutional requirement and National Assembly should be an institution that should safeguard the Constitution by adhering to the principles. How did you lead to that two-thirds of the National Assembly? Because according to them, they didn't understand actually whether you have the two-thirds of the Parliament.
Well, according to the Constitution, whatever is done within the limits or remits of our standing orders, you cannot question any court of law as long as it is within that bounds. So that is what is saving the National Assembly to a certain extent, but certain things can be questioned in a court of law when it is questioned whether the law itself exceeds what is legally required by the Constitution. So if you do anything that violates the Constitution, ultimately that can be questioned in a court of law. That must be understood, because the court can even declare certain laws to be null and void by virtue of the fact that they contradicts provision of the Constitution. And we should really bear that in mind. I believe you could see that I was raising my hand at a given time to explain, but you know, the enthusiasm was already there to give the 45 days, since the National Assembly has shown its power that it can reduce what the executive brought to us. I believe that that is what really moved many people to feel that, well, why don't we just try this and move on? But in actual fact, the question of numbers is fundamental in decision making in the National Assembly. And there is a fundamental flaw in our standing orders that must be remedied as quickly as possible. It was in the original standing orders, but somehow it has been left. I think it must have been by omission, but not because they feel that it's not necessary. And that is division. When you have division, there is a decision made by voice. Aye, nay. You can hear loud when ayes is the majority. But this is when you deal with majority vote. There are certain decisions in the National Assembly you can decide on the basis of a majority. And it's not focusing as long as you have quorum. But there are certain decisions that go beyond quorum. It talks about decision of the whole National Assembly. And the Constitution is very clear on that. When it says two-thirds, it does not say two-thirds of those present. It says two-thirds of the members. That means the totality of the members is what you must base the two-thirds on. If it says three-quarter, it means the totality of the members. Two-thirds of the members. It's not saying two-thirds of those present. And you can see that not all the members are always present. To have that provision, I'm sure that's one thing that any of us, and I'm sure each of us, should be prepared as quickly as possible to inject it in the standing orders in terms of division. That is why if the aye nay is not clear enough, then you must go into voting. And going into voting, you must indicate who voted, who abstained, and who voted against by calling the names of the National Assembly members. So in that, you identify how each votes, then you will count. And if you do not have two-thirds, the decision fails, even if the majority has voted for a particular thing. As long as it's two-thirds of the members, if those abstain are in the majority or are large enough to deprive the voters of two-thirds decision, then the decision fails. So therefore, it is important, therefore, to ensure that you know who voted for what. And it is based on that vote you can judge the National Assembly members tomorrow. That's why in some countries they will all tell you when this bill came, you voted this way, and then they will show whether you are conservative or you are progressive or you are anti a particular thing. That is important, and we must preserve that, and we must grow to adopt that. That's fundamental. It's a constitutional requirement.
So you were going to the regulations, so I can just leave you to just give us what are the regulations, because this is something that we don't understand, most of the Gambian people, what is being regulated and what has been approved by the National Assembly, and it went further up to the transport, in regards of the restrictions that were made on the transport, the market vendors, the non-essential and the essential commodities. It goes further into so many issues. So if you can set light on this thing so that the general public can understand actually what were the regulations passed at the National Assembly.
Yes, it's important to deal with the regulations, but it's also important to deal with the context. The context of the vote, the executive told the National Assembly that measures are necessary to be able to deal with COVID-19. And those measures come in the form of regulations. And 4 regulations were given to the National Assembly. That is also important. Yes, we had to treat them as regulations, but what is a matter of must is that each regulation must be published in the Gazette. And you should be able to go and purchase it at the printing department, government printers, and have a copy. That is absolutely necessary, and we will recommend very strongly that the Attorney General follows the printing of those gazettes so that one will be able to affirm that they exist, so that the law enforcement officers will not just rely on what is declared on TV, but will have a legal department that will say, these are the regulations, now go and enforce them. The Inspector General of Police must have a legal department where he is asked to enforce. The legal department must be able to say, yes, we now have the gazettes in our hands directly from the printing, from the government source, and that here they are, and this is what they say, go and enforce this. That is required. Otherwise, we will have impunity. Otherwise, we will have arbitrary rule. So this should be a lesson to us. Number 2, some people are questioning why the National Assembly gave 45 days. Some are even saying, if there is any problem, any hunger, any hardship, well, the National Assembly is also an aider and abettor of maladministration. Well, these are things that we should weigh based on evidence before we pass judgment. It is important for the people to realize that COVID-19 is accepted to be a threat. And all countries had closed their borders, almost. And air traffic had been controlled. Economies are declining. Why would a whole world commit sabotage against the economy of each country for something that is a myth? Obviously, if Gambia just remained as normal, the whole world would have isolated Gambia and believed that Gambians are of a different kind. So something had to be done. And there is no doubt a state of emergency was necessary. What does it mean? It means that the government is telling us that these are the measures that we could take to be able to contain COVID-19 or to even it is defeated when it arrives. It is the right of the Gambia to go anywhere, to move out of the Gambia, to stay in the Gambia. Right of the Gambian that if you are arrested within 72 hours, you must be released or taken before a court. It is the right of the Gambian for you not to come and order that person against his will to say, I'm going to keep you somewhere for 14 days, and as they use their language, to quarantine them. What powers would the state rely on to do that? Those are emergency powers. And those are the ones they should spell out in regulations. And those are the powers that must be examined, to be seen, to be reasonable. So it means that if you arrive at the airport and they say you cannot come in, you are obstructing the movement of that person in normal terms. But if you are doing so based on a regulation, due to a proclamation made because of a state of health threat, then that becomes reasonable and justifiable only if the doctors prescribe why you should be held under observation, or who you should be taken for observation, protective observation, and explain how long. The doctors indicate that the virus will reveal its real strength within 14 days, that you should be properly diagnosed to have the illness or not. Therefore, protective observation would last 14 days. So it will be reasonable and justifiable to remove a person from the family and keep the person for those 14 days. That's what the state of emergency means. Now, if the state comes and said it wants to do that, you want the National Assembly to be opposed to that and say that people should just take business as normal, then the National Assembly will be seen to be an aider and abetter of genocide against our people. So whoever says that the state of emergency should not be supported would definitely not be thinking in the context of what COVID-19 is all about. Now, furthermore, it is very clear that if you are saying we must sit within 2 meters of each other so that we will be able to contain the illness, what is the medical basis for that? That's what the National Assembly should ask. Why should be all public gatherings where people are, you are saying now it must be contained in such a way that people should always sit 2 meters from each other. Once you say they should sit 2 meters from each other, it means that most public gatherings can no longer be, because compounds, if you have a wedding, naming ceremony, and people sit 2 meters from each other, how many people will be in the compound? So once you control a space, then the question is why? And a regulation must be able to back that, because you cannot enforce that without a regulation. But then that regulation must be reasonable and justifiable. Why is it reasonable and justifiable? The doctors say when you have the illness, when you cough, it leaves your mouth, the organisms will leave your mouth and could reach the mouth of the other person, could reach the nostrils, could reach the eye, and penetrate the individual and contaminate the individual and infect the individual. That's what the doctors say. National Assembly members did not say that. The doctors said that universally. So therefore they said that one way of containing the illness, this is a virus, once it leaves the mouth, it cannot travel a long distance and it will fall on the ground. And for them, the safe space is 2 meters. Who are we to question them? We do not have the medical evidence to question them. Therefore, if they say public gatherings should be regulated, should we oppose that? We cannot oppose that. And that we should wash our hands. We should not shake hands. Because they said, if you have the illness, you cough, you sneeze, it falls in your hands, and you put your hands in the hands of another person, you'll transfer the illness. They are encouraging that we stop shaking hands. We encourage washing hands. So in short, before we go to the details of the regulation, No one doubts that the state of emergency is necessary. No one doubts that measures should be taken that are reasonably justifiable to be able to deal with COVID-19 pandemic. Then we go to the third phase. Are we convinced that we should give the state 45 days, 90 days, or less? What should be the basis of our decision? The basis of our decision is for the state to convince us that within 90 days, it will amass the material and human resources necessary and will utilize the regulation in place to be able to contain the illness. That's what the state is telling us, that within 90 days, if we are given the authority to extend the state of emergency, we'll be able to achieve that task. Is that a bad aim? It's not a bad aim. In fact, that is the precise aim that we should put in place to be able to deal with COVID-19. But the National Assembly member said, well, 90 days without any assessment would not be prudent to give. What we should try to do is to test what the state proclaims to be the measures. The proclamation, yes, is made, but we are more concerned about the viability of the measures in achieving the aim for which they are made. So therefore, even if those there are differences in terms of time to be given, 2 weeks, 1 month, 45 days, regardless of the time frame, the objective is clear. It is to give the state lesser time so that it amasses the human material resources, carry out all the measures necessary to be able to address COVID-19 pandemic. Then the National Assembly will do the assessment during the periods of 45 days, 30 days, or 2 weeks, or 90 days to be able to come with a decision. But the National Assembly had decided that they will give 45 days. This is the period given to the state to amass all the resources necessary to be able to address the problem, and the National Assembly will assess. That is the basis of the decision. In that regard, we must now look at the regulations. The objective of the regulation is to manage public space in such a way that we prevent the spread of the illness. That is the focal point. So it is therefore important to see that the epicenter of transferring illness that is called COVID-19 is social relationships and social gathering. That is the epicenter for transferring the illness. It is that epicenter that must be controlled. And that is why all the regulations aim to address the issue of public gathering, the public space, as well as the life of the people, the impact on their lives. There are 4 regulations that were brought to the National Assembly and given to the National Assembly members. The 4 regulations, one of them is regulating what no one can do, the places where food is bought. The first regulation indicates that they will restrict how markets and places where people buy things are managed. And they indicated that in all the markets, they must ensure that only food items are sold and non-food items are classified as non-essentials, and those who have those shops or stalls would have to close them down. In doing that, what they are telling us is they want to regulate the public space in the market so that the stalls will be 2 meters from each other. And those who come to buy will come one at a time to limit the contact between the seller and the buyer. That is the aim. Whether they achieve that or not is what we must assess, but that is the aim. And that is what the regulation says. The regulation further says that within 100 meters of the market, all that should be sold is food items and nothing more. All other shops that are not selling food items should also be closed. But that after 100 meters, business could continue, but on the new conditions of the 2 meters being kept and not more than 2 people going into the shops to buy at a time. These are the provisions. 2 meters everywhere, so as to maintain safe spacing. Is that being respected? That is the question. So in that regard, many people have shown their dissatisfaction that people going to the market from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. is not enough. But if you look at the regulation, the objective was go up to 2 p.m. and close down, then clean the place, sanitize the place. Because the lesson is that the virus will not be able to reach your nostrils if you sit 2 meters away. But what happens to the virus? It falls to the ground or on objects. And it survives for a time because it's a living organism. Maybe doctors will tell you how long it will be. They are researching on how long will it be able to survive under the sun, on the surface, under the cold environment. That's for the researchers to tell us. But essentially, that's why cleanliness of the environment becomes important. But are they sanitizing the markets after 2 p.m.? Is it just a law for its sake? This is what we should examine. This is what journalists should go and find out. This is what the National Assembly members must also find out. But every decision would also have an implication. But let's go on with the rest of the regulation and we look at the implications and what should be done about the implication. Because some who have not been selling food are protesting vigorously that they are also going to be killed if they do not have means to survive. And they are also the buyers of the goods that are essential goods, and if they don't go there, still a business would not grow. So they are demanding for something to be done to address their fate. And I agree with them entirely that something has to be done and should be done with speed, without any delay, to address their conditions. But we'll come to that. Number 2, there is the provision of restriction in terms of transportation, reducing number of people in the transports and restricting the fares. So many of those people who own the transport are protesting vigorously. This means that they will earn less. So what should be done about that? Of course, they did that to encourage safe spacing, but at the expense of the economic interests of the owner of the vehicle as well as the person employed to drive the vehicle. What should we do? We will hear what they have to say. Something has to be done. It is absolutely necessary. They've also closed down quite a number of places that they call non-essential public places. They've also ensured that certain spaces are regulated. The going to funerals and all this, well, how do you ensure that they are regulated? It's not clearly indicated that you must have this, but if they say 5 people, but then the question is, do you maintain the distance? Because if you maintain a distance of 2 meters, could you be seen to be engaged in a public gathering? What is a public gathering? Is it when we sit 5 close to each other? But if we spread, then how do we conceive it? So there, my concern is, let's not focus too much on the concept of public gathering, but let's focus on the concept of safe space for us to be healthy, so that we limit people who will occupy a given space for wedding, to ensure that we maintain the 2 meters. And where you cannot fit, then leave and come at another time for our common safety. People were saying that mosques are closed. I said that is not part of the regulation. What is important is not what the president declared with a proclamation under Section 34, which gives him no authority to make regulation. It's under Section 35, which is not mentioned in the proclamation. So in that sense, the regulation is what matters that we have. And if we see any new regulation, we'll tell you. But it is important for those who control the places of worship to know that life is precious and COVID-19 is a killer, just like Ebola was a killer and killed many imams, because at first people doubted what it was capable of doing. And eventually many lives were lost. So it is important that we respect the safe spacing. And what that safe spacing will tell you, well, how many people will be able to fit in the praying place, in the place of worship. Number 2, how do we worship? So would the person leave the organism by bowing down? If that happens, what do you do? Would everybody still bring your own? So it is those people who are managing lives in those spaces who would say, well, it's not worth it, because when we pray together, this is why we should, maybe because of the illness, this is not possible. So we are taking our own decision as to how to manage our own faith. That is how it should be handled. Each person should take responsibility for the people who follow you and guide them properly, not misguide them to their death. And don't go against state regulation because it's just a state regulation. Find out what the regulation is. Is it reasonable and justifiable? Challenge it if it is not reasonable and justifiable, so that all of us will do what is reasonable and justifiable to combat COVID-19. Whatever we do must be reasonable and justifiable to kill the virus, to defeat COVID-19. So in that sense, we look at that public space, and the last phase is the price controls. In a state of emergency, there is hardship, but people must live. And that's why effort must be made to make food accessible, not at a point where the person who is selling will ultimately become bankrupt. So it means that economists must be there to study what system of price control should exist. How do you manage the situation? How do you compensate when people give goods, only to discover that they also run into bankruptcy? So these are issues that are already coming as a result of implementation of the regulations. And therefore, at the market, the government must reassess to see whether safe spacing can still be met by those who are selling what you call non-essential goods, and that you will not have the type of crowd that will negate safe spacing. That is the bottom line. Nothing should negate safe spacing. If you see that they cannot all fit, could you identify a place where you locate as a temporary market? Create some makeshift areas and allow people to have these 2 meters and to be selling there. Could that be a temporary measure? The state should explore all measures. But if you see that no measure exists that will be able to address the problem of those people who are squeezed out, then the state must think of possibilities of compensation and must do so with speed. So when we talk about compensation, it should concentrate on people of that nature with such demand. The same thing with the drivers. The country must examine how to minimize their cost, because it's cost benefit. How do you minimize their cost so that they will enjoy the same benefit that they were enjoying without inconveniencing the population and threatening the lives of people by negating safe spacing or increasing fares beyond the capacity of the public to pay and increase their hardship? Here the state must again come, where there's reduction of petrol or any other means, reduction of taxes, payment of duties in the garages. So different measures must be taken and adopted to ensure that those people also do not suffer because of the measures taken for safe spacing to protect lives. It is important all the way to examine all the other disadvantages. For example, at the Lumos, some people used to go to Senegal to purchase goods and sell. If the borders are closed, they are going to suffer. So in that sense, you must be able to identify and trace all those people who had been impacted on by the decision, by the regulation. And how much have they been impacted on? How do you address their hardship? That is primarily what should happen.
Yeah. That's well explained, Honourable Sallah. You talk about the price control and you talk about the issue of the transport. You look at the Gambian context, country that one can say we don't have sufficient public transportation. We have individual owned transportation system. You pass the regulation that says that you must carry half of your passengers, and you even went further to decrease the fares rather than increasing them at the level, because they are losing 7 passengers or 2 passengers in their vehicle. And this has been a constraint that it has even put hardship in the citizens rather than, because you will close, because drivers are now protesting that they will not drive because it's not favorable for them. They are even losing rather than gaining, so they decide not to even brave the road rather than park their cars. And it takes passengers to pay 4 fares or 6 fares. They will drive from Westfield to Taboko and drop it down, Taboko to Brigam, rather than going direct to Brigam because of the imposed rates on them. What could have been done by the government in trying to at least help so that it will be a win-win situation? The drivers who can ride the routes when they will not be running in loss, and whilst the citizens who will have transport to go back to their work, since working institutions are still working, they are going to work and coming back. But we didn't see any strategy coming from the side of the government. And if you look at the price control too, I have a complaint from various people that they have seen the list of government price in terms of rice, but they have seen a huge difference, like the people living in the provinces and the ones in the greater Banjul area. They will say a bag of rice in the greater Banjul area is $1,050. But those living in Pasir Jarason will buy it for $1,250. So for them, they have seen a discrimination. They thought the state would have at least fill those gaps in terms of transportation, where they will have warehouses and various regions, whereby they can purchase those rice and send it to the warehouse, and these people will buy it and they can come in and help, because we are in an emergency situation and business has been closed. So what would be your take on these two issues?
Fundamentally, we must look at what exists and what could be, the real and the ideal. The real situation is that the government says it must declare a state of emergency, it must have regulations to encourage safe spacing, otherwise we will not be able to defeat COVID-19. What should the National Assembly do? Say, no, it's all right, leave everything as normal. Of course, nobody will say that we should just fold our hands and do nothing. For the government, those are the measures that it believes could actually contain the illness. Is it right that we need safe spacing? Yes. But then, what about the implications? Do they have a task force to actually take note of the implications? That is what is important. Not only enforcement of the price regulations, etc., and taking people to court, but also receiving complaints from those who respect the regulations only to have to suffer economic losses. Fundamentally, schools are closed. For what reason? Because children play together, they play football, they are always with each other. And if you allow that forum where you fail to control the public space, then you'll be spreading the illness. So closing schools is designed to encourage safe spacing. But what do you do with the children? And how will they continue their education? You said you'll use radio, you'll use television. How many of them will have that? As you have mentioned, those up country, because of system of transportation, the cost of all foodstuff increases as you have transport taking them to farther afield. Because the port is here, the goods are brought down here and then taken up there. So in that sense, they are still thinking from the angle of economic cost rather than the social ramification of relying on pure economic cost. Once you say that you want to regulate the prices, for what purpose? For the purpose of combating COVID-19, and you are regulating prices so that you will not enhance hardship, then you must also ensure the continuity of supply. So you must ensure that your aim of reducing hardship is universal, and that would require the subsidy of government. That is absolute must. But the current situation is that you have a government which did not have a contingency plan, a government which still relies on taxation for its revenue or grants or domestic borrowing. A government that must borrow to be able to finance its budget. That's the reality. So whatever we tell the government to do now, it must come from three sources: from taxation, from government borrowing, or from grants. Because the government is not a government that builds sovereign national wealth to manage the affairs of a country. So its system of health will be crippled by virtue of resource constraint. So if it is to function at all, it must make tremendous sacrifices to be able to do that. It is depriving one side to provide for the other side. So essentially we must accept that reality, that is the reality that Gambia is confronting, that since 1965 we are dealing with a country where 48 to 58% of the population are living in abject poverty. And if you go further afield in the countryside, 70% of the population would be living on less than $1 a day. And we are told recently that under the current circumstances, over 60% of the population lives on less than $1 a day. So in that sense then, less than $100 a day. So in that sense, we are dealing with the poverty issue, and then COVID-19 comes. So how do you ensure that COVID-19 does not worsen the poverty? Is fundamentally what we must address. How do we ensure that in fact COVID-19 helps us to carry out greater social protection? That is the challenge the government is faced. But it's a government that is not prepared. It is now that it must work hard to address the problem. Fundamentally, therefore, instead of dealing with the ideal to deal with the real, the government should have put in place a multi-ministerial, interministerial task force dealing with all the components. The ministry dealing with social welfare should have been empowered to give more information, to know exactly the poverty that exists in the country, and to be able to have a program that will address the poverty level. And they should be able to have their own call station where people will be calling to talk about their poverty. That is absolutely essential. So in that sense then, all these problems that we are talking about in terms of the rural and urban area where people are actually poor would have been handled from the very beginning when the state of emergency was declared, and by now we should have been able to gather all the facts that are necessary to know which sectors are more vulnerable and what to do about them, and start the process of doing something about it. And we'll ask the question, what could they do about it? Number two, we've seen those people who, by virtue of the regulations, are asked to sell at a lower level or frozen, even though they have to go and buy fresh goods and they don't know how much it will be in the market tomorrow. And the same thing with the drivers. You need a toll where those people will immediately register a problem, and there'll be a group there studying it, technicians and the ministers, to know concretely what do we need to do. Is it reducing fuel prices? Is it removing taxation on certain goods and services that we consider to be main things? What will happen? Projections. Where can they purchase? To look for sources of the raw materials that they need, to be able to provide for that. So in that regard, they would have been able to provide real short, medium, long-term projections to be able to deal with the problem and give those people some element of comfort. You talked about the prices variation in the countryside. They could have ensured real systematic stabilization of all the prices by knowing what type of subsidy will be necessary to be able to subsidize the prices. Those are the areas that the government, since the declaration of the public emergency, should have been able to tell you immediately when you interview the minister that we have taken these measures to be able to address it. Not only that, if you look at the act itself, it shows you that government, under certain circumstances, should be able to take charge of certain facilities to improve the living conditions of the people. If you were following recently, you will see that that fishing factory is no longer functioning. Now, those people who are fisher folks coming to sell there are actually complaining that they cannot sell their fish. And we are still just looking at that factory closed by its owners because of the threat to Covid-19. What is the government doing? It has power for regulation. It has power to go and take over that factory temporarily, open wherever you need to freeze whatever fish may come, buy all that fish from the fisher folks and ask them to go and fish more, put it there, take care of it, and put it in the market at lower prices for the people to be able to have fish. At a given level, when the people's income are completely, it can even give distribution of food for the people to be able to eat. That's what a government should do. And why is it not doing it? And it is part and parcel of a state of public emergency. So in real terms, government can partner with those who are in the private sector at the moment, for them to reach an understanding whether it's going to be a 1 month period, 2 month period, to ensure that the society does not move down to terrible hardship. It can be done, and it should be done. And in terms of school, it's the same thing. You will have a toll there to ensure, a call there to ensure that whoever have children where problems exist, is not, they have no radio, immediately to call, and they could be provided with the facilities. That's where you should inject resources, and you should continue to harness resources to be able to address those concrete problems. So what is really required at the moment is not just to say that there should not have been a state of emergency, there should be no regulation, but impact assessment of what the regulations have done and damage control to ensure that whoever is disadvantaged is heard, and not only heard, but the problem should be addressed, is responded to. That is necessary. But in actual fact, most of these countries are not prepared for such emergencies. We have said it over and over again. Today, history has proven us correct. A state is a protector of the people. Now it's clear. States that believe that just leave few people to make a lot of wealth and they will be able to save the rest of society is not true. One should not be say you are against people making wealth. Fine. But don't make them protectors of the people. The private sector cannot be the protector of the people. The private sector can help in the productive base of an economy, but it is the state that is the protector of the people, and it cannot protect them without resources. That is clear. And that is why today you go to America, there is a lockdown. They are saying 9 out of every 10 Americans is in. The state must send checks. Before they saw this as a mechanism to promote laziness in society. And therefore anybody who is poor is lazy, so leave them there to suffer. But today it has been proven to be false that everybody who receives a check from the state is a poor person. Now companies are receiving checks from state to be able to survive. Individuals are receiving checks from state to be able to augment their income, because the state is a protector of the people. But how can it be a protector of the people without resources? How can it depend on grants, on loans, on taxes alone? No. It means the material resources of society, our land, our sea, our atmosphere, must be exploited to the maximum and ensure that the state is capable of enhancing agricultural production. Are we really safe in terms of food production? How much food do we have in store? We are importing $2.4 billion worth of rice. If we do not receive grants in form of rice, how are we going to purchase all that and bring it to the society if businesses also collapse? So the lesson is clear. It is saying that each country must be self-reliant. And that is the philosophy that many countries have kicked against all these years. But poverty remains. And now the worst of poverty is being faced. All countries are suffering from the trend towards lockdown, and their economies are being ring-fenced so that essentially there is no flow from one country to the other. People's movements are being restricted, and those economies that depend entirely on services, especially the travel services, are bound to suffer extremely in terms of deprivation of revenue and resources and employment to their people. So in that sense, this is also a reawakening for us to understand that all countries have the productive base to be able to sustain their people, and that international trade is just a facilitator to our self-reliant development if we ensure that we trade on the basis of mutual interest and on the basis of equality. The world of the people is now to be built. COVID-19 is a confirmation that we need a new world order, and our brains must begin to rethink what that new world order must be. We are not now given the choice. It is a matter of must that we must create that new order that promotes self-reliance. We can produce all the food that we need. The state could have had a cooperative bank. It would have facilitated agricultural production by giving seed, fertilizer, farming implements to the farmers. They would have produced all the rice and grain. By now, it would have been in stores. And what we'll do is to facilitate general distribution and ensure that we maintain a healthy population. And with that healthy population, we give them more to produce.
Yes, Honourable Sallah, you have touched an area which is very deep when it comes to the issue of this COVID-19. And by studies or what we have seen so far, it has exposed the disorganized of the society that we live in. And we could see since the emergence of COVID-19, it has affected livelihoods of Gambian people to an extent that we have seen individuals, even some political parties or other individuals have gone into the community providing food for these people. But if you look at the quantity of food being provided, like saying they are fighting against the poverty of the people, you look at giving a bag of rice to someone, which we applaud it, that's what they can do. But one bag of rice, a 5 liter of oil, and this, for me, it could not eradicate it because the poverty of this country is continuity. People have been suffering for a quite long time. And these issues are not the solution. So what should be the approach of the government if individuals are doing this, going out giving food items to people that they know that their business has been affected, or this coronavirus has affected their livelihood? But we only see individuals going to house to house giving them food materials for some political activities, and other Gambians in the diaspora even went further to create what they call National Go Fund, whereby they will be feeding the families that are affected. What should be the approach of the government in terms of situations like this?
Well, I have talked about the real and the ideal. We are now dealing with the real situation. The real situation, I have told you, is very clear. The government depends on taxes, loans, and grants to be able to have an income. And it is from there that you provide any other service to the population. So it means that you must have a lot of environment, taking resources from one area and put it in another area to be able to provide the social needs of the population, or get international assistance to be able to do so. And that is likely what is and will continue to be, government taking that route. You will also see that where you have a society that is poor, anybody who can acquire anything that the people need, where there is clothes, where there is shoes, where there is food, you will bring it and take it, because people will take anything. The beggar has no choice. And the country is a country of beggars. And that is why anybody can become a humanitarian of clout by giving what the people don't have. And nobody can complain about that, nobody can condemn that. It's just to accept the fact that that is Gambia. Now, in that regard, you will see that it even changed our politics in the past, in the present, and will do so in the future unless we understand the state and what it has the capacity to do. The state has the capacity to be productive, to provide sovereign national wealth to be able to provide for all of us. You've seen that factory. Fisher folks go and bring the fish to them, they turn it into fish meal, oil, and export it. That's what that sector will do. And one should not blame them. That's what they do, and that's what they are set out to do. They did not set out to remove a people from poverty. It is the country, the elected representative, the state, that has that responsibility. So in that sense, if we had control of that factory by the government and get all that fish there and assisting those fisher folks with vessels, etc., trawlers, for them to fish, will we lack fish?
No.
The price of fish will go down, and in a state of emergency, it will be distributed freely because the resources belong to the people. And nothing will ever stop that type of production and distribution. So that is the reality that we must face under the current circumstances, that we do not have an ideal Gambia with a state that builds a stock of sovereign national wealth to be able to provide for its citizenry. So we depend on beggars. So those in the private sector who have some humanitarian sentiments will be able to say, let's raise funds, but how much will they be able to raise? And how much can people give from their bank accounts? So clearly, it is only a state that has the capacity to be able to give the stimulus that you have seen, American governments giving to the private sector, etc. And they continue to mystify what individuals can do. No nation can be fed from pockets. Nation must be fed from the national coffers. That enables people to be productive, not just consumption, maybe in a state of emergency, but the basis is to promote production of the people. So we need production-based subsidies and welfare in developing countries like the Gambia so that we produce in abundance. That is the only way we can move in the future. I have said it over and over again. Not even before the emergency. You will see people will go and dig a borehole. Of course, it will be appreciated. And some even mention that as showing what you can do if you are elected as a representative. And you know, there's an insult. Because each village should have a village treasury. Each village should be able to have a village farm. And the people, rather than paying taxes, can go and work, contribute in labor on that farm. And the state can give fertilizers and farming implements. If they are close to places where you can have aquaculture, it can provide aquaculture facilities. So in that sense, what is produced will actually be in the village treasury to be able to produce the borehole that you need, or even provide the type of food assistance that you need in times of emergency. So we are not prepared as a people to have the type of state that is productive, that enables people to be productive and therefore guarantee their food security and their food safety. That is what does not exist. So we are dealing with a real situation and not the ideal situation which should be. And in a real situation, well, let all do whatever they can to reduce hardship, because that's the most we can do. But ultimately, that is not the solution.
Thank you, Honourable. I think I have no further question, but just to thank you for granting us this interview. Almost we have hundreds of people watching you right away, and they have most of them raised some issues that I just want to draw your attention to, because they have been part of the programs and they want to just inquire about the 500 million that was addressed by the Minister of Finance when he appeared before you people. And they said they have so far seen so many donations coming from the official, the bank association, the Gambia Bankers Association, which was presented yesterday to the Minister of Finance. Whether there is a committee in the National Assembly that will look at all these resources and make sure that these monies reflect to the intended purpose, that is COVID-19, whether the lives of the Gambian people or the medication that will be provided if it goes seriously, whether you guys will be ready to at least give an information to the population how these monies were spent, since the issue of the state of emergency came before you people to approve it, and you have made it very clear to the state that there will be a committee that will be monitoring the whole activities of the state of emergency, and there are funds that are coming because of the COVID-19, and 12 million, 10 million, 500 million that was approved by the national, that the minister said from the other budgets allocated, there was this 5 million that was approved. Whether you guys are ready to inform the public how these monies will be spent.
It is very clear in the Constitution that every money received by the government should be paid into the consolidated fund. So it is important for all of us to bear in mind that that money must not be spent unless there is a law providing for it. So in that sense, the population should be well assured that the National Assembly is fundamentally prepared, individually and collectively, to continue to monitor what happened during this period. That is why a select committee has been established to continue to monitor the implementation of the regulations. I am sure they are currently sitting. I'm not to speak for them, but I'm sure eventually they have their press conferences and explain how far they have gone. So I will not jump the gun. I will leave them to carry on their duties, and you follow what they inform you regarding what they have been assigned to do on behalf of the National Assembly in terms of monitoring the regulations and looking at the impact assessment of the regulations within these 45 days, and then report to Parliament. This is what they've been assigned to do. It is also significant to understand that by virtue of different roles being played by different National Assembly members and different competencies, you are seeing explanations evolving on a daily basis, and transparency must come. The 500 million initially was announced to be allocated by government, and questions have been raised. I would not want to go deeply into it at the moment, because you've heard during the last sitting of the National Assembly before we adjourned sine die, they told you, the Minister of Finance told you that not a single butut has been spent on that 500 million. That's what we are told, and that's what we are going to take as the baseline for the fund. They've told us how they have managed to mobilize the 12 million for the health ministry to start. We've also heard from this health minister that the 500 million is not only for the health sector, that is also directly from the mouth of the minister. So what is important and what we are recommending for the government to do, and it may have already done it, but we, the National Assembly members, will assess whether that has been done, is that you must have a work plan costed and shared with the National Assembly and with the population at large regarding where the money, the 500 million, if it is viable, because there is a law, Public Finance Act, which says under Section 29 that you can vie between budgetary agencies. So you'll have a ministry with different budgetary agencies, and you may allocate them billions. So in that sense, you can go to certain agencies, and the millions allocated to them, you take it and shift it to another budgetary agencies. That is possible, and we are waiting for the report of the minister. I am sure many people now know that the Minister of Finance is duty-bound during every session of the National Assembly to come and give report on budget implementation. So there is no doubt that whatever money is received and how it is spent will be clearly explained by the minister to the National Assembly, and we'll all hear it together and share it together. So people should not have any doubt about that. But notwithstanding, delay can come, And our role now is to prevent that delay by sharing our expertise in all domains. It is fundamentally important now for the Ministry of Finance with the team, health, and all the other trade to look to compute how much is being lost individually by those who are deprived from selling in the markets and shops, and drivers, traders, in terms of the price controls. They should maintain that data and share it with the population and identify what should be done to subsidize the losses. That is a matter of must.